Private Miller was studying alone when he overheard the old man on the phone, speaking in what sounded like Russian. But when the call ended, the stranger turned around and said in perfect English, "Son, we need to talk. You just heard something that could get us both killed. If you want to see how this incredible story unfolds and ends with a moment that will give you chills, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support helps us bring you more incredible stories of hidden heroes and unexpected encounters." The fluorescent lights of Fort Carson's main library hummed quietly overhead. It was 2,147 hours on a Tuesday evening in March, and the library was nearly empty except for a handful of soldiers studying for advancement exams. Private First Class David Miller sat hunched over a tactical operations manual in the far corner of the second floor. At 22, he had been in the army for 18 months and was studying for his promotion to specialist. The material was dense, full of battlefield communication protocols that made his head spin after 12 hours of duty. Miller rubbed his tired eyes and reached for his lukewarm coffee. Outside, Colorado's late winter wind rattled the windows. He had chosen this corner deliberately. The reference section was rarely visited after 2,100 hours, giving him the solitude needed to focus on complex tactical scenarios that he had noticed the elderly civilian earlier. The man appeared to be in his 70s, dressed in a simple grey sweater and dark slacks. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he wore wire-rimmed glasses. What struck Miller as unusual was the man's seating choice. Deliberately isolated, back to the wall, reading materials obscured from view. The old man had been there for over 2 hours, occasionally taking notes in a small leather notebook. His movements were economical and precise, suggesting military background despite his civilian appearance. Miller returned to his manual, struggling with joint operations coordination. The concepts required intense concentration, so he barely registered the soft buzz of a phone vibrating. It was only when he heard the quiet voice speaking in what sounded like Russian that his attention shifted. The elderly man had answered his phone and was speaking in low, measured tones. Miller's basic Russian training was minimal, but he recognized the language. What struck him as odd was the man's tone, authoritative and confident, not casual conversation. The old man's voice carried urgency, and several times Miller caught what sounded like numbers being repeated, coordinates, perhaps, or dates. The conversation lasted 8 minutes, during which the elderly man never raised his voice or showed agitation. When the call ended, the library returned to quiet. Miller glanced over and saw the old man closing his notebook and gathering materials. Their eyes met across the space between bookshelves. The elderly man studied Miller for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate care, he stood and walked directly toward Miller's table. His gait was steady and purposeful, not the shuffle typically associated with his apparent age. As he approached, Miller could see sharp, alert eyes that belied his grandfatherly appearance. "Son," the man said quietly, pulling out the chair across from Miller without invitation. "We need to talk. You just heard something that could get us both killed." Miller's blood went cold. The tactical manual in his hands suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the gravity in the stranger's voice. "Sir, I'm sorry, I don't understand. I was just studying and dash." "You understand more than you think you do," the old man interrupted gently. "Your file says you completed basic Russian language training at Fort Gordon. Enough to recognize when someone is discussing operational parameters in a language they assume no one else in a Colorado military library would comprehend." The fact that this civilian knew details about Miller's training record was deeply unsettling. Miller glanced around the library, suddenly aware of how isolated their corner had become. The other soldier who had been studying was gone, and they were now completely alone in this section of the building. "Who are you?" Miller asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small leather wallet. He opened it briefly, allowing Miller to see an identification card that looked official but unlike any he had encountered before. The text was partially obscured, but Miller caught glimpses of words like classified and department of before the wallet snapped shut. "My name is Viktor Petrov," the man said. "And before you ask, yes, that is my real name, though I haven't used it professionally in over 40 years. Miller's mind raced. A Russian name, a classified ID, and a phone conversation in Russian conducted in a US military facility. Every instinct told him to report this immediately, but something about Petrov's demeanor gave him pause. The man didn't seem threatening or nervous. If anything, he appeared resigned. "You're thinking about calling security," Petrov observed. It's what you were trained to do, and under normal circumstances, it would be the correct response. However, these are not normal circumstances. Then what are they? Miller asked. Petrov glanced around the library before answering. Complicated. Tell me, Private Miller, what do you know about Operation Blackwater? Miller searched his memory. The name sounded vaguely familiar, possibly from a military history class, but he couldn't place specific details. I think it was mentioned in training, but I don't remember specifics. Most people don't. It was officially discontinued in 1987, though certain aspects continued under different names and classifications. Petrov leaned forward slightly. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to listen carefully because your life may depend on understanding it. The heating system kicked on with a loud mechanical groan, causing both men to tense momentarily. Miller realized his hands were shaking slightly, whether from cold or adrenaline, he couldn't tell. Operation Blackwater was a joint intelligence program, Petrov continued. Americans and Soviets working together on threats that superseded Cold War politics. Threats that both governments agreed were more dangerous than their mutual animosity. Miller stared at him. That's impossible. During the Cold War, we were enemies. Publicly, yes. But there are always deeper currents, Private Miller. Threats that make even enemies into temporary allies. I was part of that program. A Soviet intelligence officer assigned to work with American counterparts on situations neither government wanted to handle alone. The implications were staggering. Miller had studied Cold War history extensively, and everything he had learned contradicted what Petrov was telling him. Why are you telling me this? Because, Petrov said, the phone call you overheard was me reporting that Operation Blackwater has been reactivated. After 37 years of dormancy, something has happened that requires the old protocols to be implemented again. Miller felt the world shift slightly around him. What kind of something? Petrov was quiet for a long moment, appearing to weigh his words carefully. 3 weeks ago, a research facility in Kazakhstan went dark. Not destroyed, not evacuated, dark. Complete communications blackout. Both American and Russian satellites show the facility is still operational. But no one is responding to any form of contact. Maybe it's just equipment failure, Miller suggested, grasping for a rational explanation. The facility was researching viral weapon countermeasures, Petrov said bluntly. Specifically, countermeasures to biological agents that neither the US nor Russia created. Agents that may not be terrestrial in origin. Miller's tactical manual slipped from his hands and hit the floor with a soft thud. You're saying aliens? I'm saying unknown origin. The distinction is important because it determines our response protocols. Petrov's voice remained steady and professional. The facility had samples of material recovered from 3 separate incidents over the past 15 years. Material that exhibited properties inconsistent with any known biological agent. The library seemed to grow colder as Petrov spoke. Miller found himself listening intently despite the impossibility of what he was hearing. Why are you telling me this instead of proper channels? Because proper channels have been compromised, Petrov replied. Someone with high-level access has been systematically eliminating people connected to the original Operation Blackwater. 7 former participants have died in the past 2 months. Heart attacks, car accidents, domestic incidents, all plausibly natural or coincidental. Miller's training kicked in. How do you know they weren't natural? Because I helped train the people who arrange such things to look natural, Petrov said matter-of-factly. When you see your own techniques used against your former colleagues, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The weight of the conversation was becoming overwhelming. Miller was a young soldier studying for a promotion exam, not someone equipped to handle international conspiracies or classified operations from decades past. What does this have to do with me? You heard my conversation, Petrov explained. The people looking for me will eventually trace that call. They'll examine security footage from this library, identify everyone who was present, and investigate whether any potential witnesses exist. When they discover you have language training and were within earshot, you'll become a person of interest. Miller's throat went dry. So what you're saying is that just being here, just overhearing your conversation, puts me in danger? Potentially, yes. Unless we handle this correctly. Petrov reached into his other pocket and produced a small electronic device that looked like a modified pager. This is a secure communication device. If activated, it will alert certain people that Operation Blackwater protocols need to be implemented. People who can protect both of us. Miller stared at the device. Why don't you activate it yourself? Because I've been burned, Petrov said. My identity is known to whoever is eliminating Blackwater veterans. If I activate the protocols, they'll know exactly where I am within minutes. But if a current US military member activates them, especially someone with no official connection to the program, it creates different response patterns. The logic was terrifying in its simplicity. Miller was being asked to become a courier for information he didn't fully understand, involving people he'd never met, in a situation that could cost him his life. What if I refuse? Then you'll return to your studies, I'll leave the library, and we'll both hope that whoever is monitoring communications traffic doesn't consider you a threat worth eliminating, Petrov said. Though based on the pattern of recent deaths, that hope may prove optimistic. Miller looked down at his tactical manual, its pages full of conventional military wisdom that suddenly seemed inadequate for the situation he found himself in. Everything in his training told him to report this conversation immediately, but Petrov's warning about compromised channels created an impossible dilemma. How do I know you're telling the truth? Miller asked. Petrov stood and walked to a nearby bookshelf. He pulled out a thick volume titled Classified Military Operations, Declassified Documents 1960 to 1990, and flipped to a specific page. He placed it in front of Miller, pointing to a heavily redacted document reproduction. Page 247. Operation Blackwater is mentioned in 3 lines of unredacted text. Joint Intelligence Initiative, discontinued 1987, participant records sealed pending review. That's all that was ever released to the public. Miller read the passage. The document appeared authentic, and the description matched what Petrov had told him. This doesn't prove anything about current reactivation or people being killed. No, it doesn't, Petrov agreed. But look at the footer of the page. Miller examined the small print at the bottom. Document declassified March 15, 2024. Review status, ongoing. 3 days ago, Petrov noted. After 37 years of sealed records, why would Operation Blackwater suddenly be under review again? And why would that review begin immediately after people connected to the program started dying? The timeline was disturbing. Miller felt himself being drawn into a logical web that made Petrov's story increasingly plausible, despite its extraordinary nature. What exactly would happen if I activated that device? Within 6 hours, representatives from both American and Russian intelligence services would arrive at this base. They would interview us separately, verify our stories, and if the situation is confirmed, implement joint protocols designed to address the threat I described. Miller studied the device Petrov had placed on the table. It looked sophisticated, but not obviously threatening. And if you're lying or delusional, then nothing happens when you activate it. You report a strange encounter with an elderly civilian to your superior officers, and you return to studying for your promotion exam, Petrov said. But if I'm telling the truth, and you do nothing, then both of us may not live to see the end of the week. The stark choice presented no good options. Miller realized he was facing a decision that would define not just his military career, but potentially his survival. The tactical manual in front of him had prepared him for conventional threats, but offered no guidance for situations involving international conspiracies and biological weapons of unknown origin. You said 7 people have died, Miller said slowly. Who were they? Petrov opened his notebook and read from a list written in careful handwriting. Dr. Elena Vasquez, biochemist, heart attack at age 54. Colonel James Richardson, Army Intelligence, car accident. Dr. Mikhail Volkov, research specialist, home invasion gone wrong. Maria Santos, translator, accidental overdose. Major Thomas Chun, Signal Corps, hiking accident. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, virology expert, house fire. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Petrov, no relation, apparent suicide. Each name was delivered with clinical precision, but Miller could see the emotion in Petrov's eyes. These weren't just statistics to him. They were colleagues, perhaps friends. You knew them personally? All of them. We worked together for 3 years during the height of Operation Blackwater. Elena and I were married for 6 months in 1983, though that's not in any official record. Petrov's voice carried a weight of loss that couldn't be fabricated. She called me 2 days before her death. She had been contacted by someone claiming to be from the CDC, asking about her work in Kazakhstan in the 1980s. Miller felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's temperature. The same facility that went dark? The same facility. Elena helped design the containment protocols for biological samples of unknown origin. Her death was ruled natural, but she was in perfect health and had no history of cardiac problems. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Miller found himself believing Petrov's story, despite its incredible nature. What was actually in that facility? Petrov hesitated. Materials recovered from 3 separate incidents. The first in Siberia in 1979, the second in Nevada in 1984, and the third in international waters in 1987. Each incident involved the recovery of biological matter that exhibited properties inconsistent with terrestrial life. Extraterrestrial, unidentified. The distinction was important to the scientists involved. They refused to speculate about origin, focusing instead on understanding the properties and potential threats. Petrov glanced at his watch. The facility's research had reached critical stages when communications ceased. If someone has gained access to those materials, Miller didn't need him to finish the sentence. Any biological weapon was dangerous enough, but one based on unknown principles could be catastrophic. Why reactivate Operation Blackwater specifically? Why not use current intelligence agencies? Because current agencies don't have institutional knowledge of the materials or the protocols developed to contain them, Petrov explained. Operation Blackwater wasn't just an intelligence program, it was a containment and response protocol. The people involved were specifically trained to handle threats that conventional military doctrine couldn't address. The library's automatic lighting system dimmed slightly, indicating the late hour. Miller realized they had been talking for over 30 minutes, and his promotion exam was tomorrow morning. But the textbook knowledge he had been memorizing seemed trivial compared to the real-world situation unfolding before him. If I activate this device, Miller said, pointing to the communicator, what happens to my military career? That depends on how the situation resolves, Petrov admitted. If the threat is confirmed and contained, you'll likely be commended for alerting proper authorities. If the threat proves false, or if I'm not who I claim to be, you may face disciplinary action for following unofficial protocols. Miller picked up the device, feeling its weight in his palm. It was heavier than it looked, suggesting sophisticated internal components. How do I know this isn't some kind of test? Maybe your intelligence, testing to see if I follow proper procedures when approached by someone claiming to have classified information. Petrov smiled for the first time since approaching Miller's table. That's exactly the kind of thinking that would have made you valuable to Operation Blackwater. Unfortunately, I don't have time to prove my authenticity through conventional means. He stood and walked to the nearby reference computers, typing rapidly. After a moment, he gestured for Miller to join him. On the screen was a database search result showing newspaper archives from 1987. Look at this article, Petrov said, pointing to a small headline. Joint military exercise concludes successfully. The brief article mentioned an international training operation involving US and Soviet personnel, concluding with standard diplomatic language about cooperation and mutual understanding. This was the cover story for Operation Blackwater's final mission, Petrov explained. The one where we contained the third incident I mentioned. If you look carefully at the photograph accompanying the article, Miller examined the grainy black and white image showing a group of military personnel standing before what appeared to be a transport aircraft. In the background, barely visible, was a younger version of the man standing next to him. That could be anyone, Miller said, though the resemblance was unmistakable. It could be, Petrov agreed. But combined with everything else I've told you, what's the probability that I'm an elaborate fraud versus someone genuinely connected to classified operations? Miller considered the question seriously. The complexity of Petrov's story, the specific details about military procedures, and the emotional weight behind his account of deceased colleagues all suggested authenticity. An elaborate deception would require extensive knowledge and careful planning that seemed unlikely for a random encounter in a military library. The phone call, Miller said suddenly. What were you actually discussing? Petrov hesitated. Verification protocols. I was confirming that certain safety measures installed at the Kazakhstan facility had been triggered. The good news is that containment appears to be holding. The bad news is that someone deliberately activated lockdown procedures, which means they're inside the facility with full access to everything stored there. The implications were staggering. Someone had gained access to biological materials of unknown origin and had the technical knowledge to manipulate the facility's security systems. How long before this becomes a larger problem? Unknown. The materials require specific storage conditions to remain stable. If those conditions are compromised, either accidentally or deliberately, the consequences could range from localized contamination to... Petrov paused. Let's just say that Operation Blackwater exists, because some threats require responses that transcend national boundaries. Miller looked at the communication device again. Such a small object to carry such enormous potential consequences. If I activate this, what exactly happens? A signal is sent to monitoring stations in both the United States and Russia. Within hours, joint response teams will be mobilized. The Kazakhstan facility will be investigated, the threat assessed, and appropriate containment measures implemented. Petrov's voice carried the weight of experience. It's not a decision to make lightly. Miller thought about his promotion exam, his career plans, his simple ambitions of advancement within conventional military structure. All of that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the possibility that his action or inaction could influence global security. You said people connected to Operation Blackwater are being killed. If we activate protocols, won't that make us targets too? Possibly, Petrov acknowledged. But remaining silent guarantees that we're targets while also allowing whatever is happening in Kazakhstan to continue unchecked. At least with protocols activated, we'll have protection and support. Miller stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened base. Soldiers were going about their evening routines, unaware that a conversation taking place in their library might affect their future security. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming for someone who had enlisted to serve his country in conventional ways. Why me? Miller asked, turning back to Petrov. Why not approach someone with higher rank or clearance? Because higher rank means more visibility and more potential for the wrong people to notice, Petrov explained. Also, because when I observed you earlier, I saw someone focused, dedicated, and methodical in his approach to learning. Those are the qualities Operation Blackwater valued most. Miller returned to the table and picked up the device again. If I do this, if I activate these protocols, I'll never be able to return to my normal military career, will I? Probably not, Petrov admitted. But you'll be serving something larger than any individual career. You'll be protecting people who will never know they were in danger. The library's silence stretched between them as Miller contemplated the decision. Everything about his training emphasized following chain of command and proper procedures. But everything about the situation suggested that conventional approaches might be inadequate or even dangerous. Tell me exactly how to activate it, Miller said finally. Petrov's expression showed relief mixed with regret. Press and hold the red button for 5 seconds. The device will vibrate once to confirm activation, then display a code number. Memorize that number and destroy this device immediately. Miller held the device, his thumb hovering over the red button. What happens to you after I activate it? I disappear again, as I have for the past 40 years. The difference is that this time, I'll have backup when the people hunting me finally find me. Petrov stood and gathered his notebook and materials. Private Miller, I want you to understand that what you're about to do may save thousands of lives, but it will certainly change yours forever. Miller pressed the button. The device vibrated once, displaying a 7-digit code. 774-9821. He stared at the numbers, committing them to memory, then looked up to find Petrov watching him intently. Thank you, Petrov said simply. He took the device from Miller's hands and, with surprising strength, crushed it between his palms. The electronic components scattered across the library table, immediately becoming unrecognizable debris. What do I do now? Miller asked. Return to your studies. Take your promotion exam tomorrow. When asked about tonight, you'll say you spent the evening alone in the library preparing for your test. Petrov paused. Within 48 hours, you'll be contacted by someone who will use the code phrase, Blackwater Protocols confirmed. When that happens, your rail service begins. Petrov turned to leave, then stopped. One final thing, Private Miller. The people who will contact you may not be what they appear to be. Trust the protocols, not the personalities. Operation Blackwater succeeds because it operates beyond normal human limitations and prejudices. With that, Viktor Petrov walked away, his footsteps echoing softly through the empty library until they faded completely. Miller sat alone among his scattered study materials, the code number burning in his memory. 7749821. He looked down at his tactical manual, its pages now seeming quaint compared to the reality he had just encountered. Outside, the Colorado wind continued its restless movement around the base, carrying with it the uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring. Miller gathered his materials and left the library, walking through the same doors he had entered hours earlier as a simple soldier studying for advancement. Now he carried knowledge that could reshape his understanding of global security international cooperation, and the hidden wars fought beyond public awareness. As he walked across the base toward his barracks, Miller realized that some forms of service begin not with formal orders or official ceremonies, but with a choice made in the quiet corners of the world, where ordinary people discover they are capable of extraordinary responsibilities. The next morning, Miller took his promotion exam and scored in the top 10%. By that afternoon, he had been approached by a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chun from the Department of Defense. Her first words to him were Blackwater protocols confirmed. His service to Operation Blackwater had begun 3 months later. The Kazakhstan facility was secured, its contents safely contained, and the threat to global security neutralized. The operation never made public headlines, appearing only as a minor note about international scientific cooperation in the back pages of a few newspapers. Private Miller, now Specialist Miller, had been permanently reassigned to a special unit whose existence was known only to a select few individuals across multiple governments. His promotion exam score had been impressive, but his real advancement came from demonstrating the judgment to act on incomplete information when the consequences of an action were unacceptable. Viktor Petrov had disappeared again after the crisis resolved, returning to whatever shadow existence he had maintained for 4 decades. But before vanishing, he had left Miller a brief note. Some service requires no recognition, only the knowledge that it was necessary. Thank you for understanding the difference. Miller kept that note, along with the memory of the evening when his simple desire to study for a promotion exam had led to his recruitment into one of the most classified programs in military history. He never saw Petrov again, but he carried forward the older man's lesson about recognizing when conventional rules must yield to extraordinary circumstances. In the base library, students continued to study at the same tables where Miller had made his life-changing decision. The reference section remained quiet and isolated, a place where knowledge was pursued and sometimes where the future of global security was determined by the choices made in whispered conversations between strangers. The tactical manual Miller had been studying that night remained on the shelf, its pages full of conventional wisdom about military operations. But those who served in Operation Blackwater understood that the most important battles are often fought not with standard tactics, but with the courage to act when action seems impossible, and the wisdom to recognize that some threats require responses that transcend ordinary understanding. Miller's story became one of many quiet victories in the ongoing protection of global security, known only to those who needed to know, remembered only by those who understood that true service often occurs in the spaces between official recognition and public awareness.